Okay, to get started on our study of classical civilizations, we're going to begin with Greek city-states. So we're going to be beginning with ancient Greece. Now, we're not going to be able to cover all of ancient Greece in these screencasts, but we're just going to touch on some major topics that I want to make sure that we pursue in class as well. All right, let's just take a look at the basic geography and how geography shaped life in ancient Greece. First of all, you got three categories here: the sea, the land, and climate. Starting off with the sea, we're going to see that they lived not on a land, but around a sea. That's important if you understand that transportation and trade routes were mostly by water. So a lot of times when people consider ancient Greece, they consider the Greek peninsula, the land. But in fact, most of the Greek society surrounded the Aegean Sea. So really you need to think about it as surrounding a sea as opposed to being on land. So let's take a look at the land. The land is pretty mountainous. 3/4 is covered by rugged mountains. Those mountains made it difficult to unite independent city-states. So as we'll see, there's a lot of independent city-states throughout the Greek peninsula and around the Aegean Sea, and it's difficult to unite them because the terrain was so rugged. And then we've got the climate, and basically you got 48 degrees in winter and 80 degrees in summer. So it's sort of a Mediterranean climate is how we might think about it. It's fairly moderate temperature, and it supported an outdoor life. So people basically could do agriculture, they could farm. There wasn't a large degree of having to worry about winter climates and snow and things of that nature. So what is a polis? This is a term that we need to define. Basically, it's a city-state. And a city-state, or the polis, was the fundamental political unit of Greece about 750 BC. And as this map shows, you can see that throughout the Greek peninsula and around the Aegean Sea, there are many different city-states. As opposed to a country or one place that's sort of united, each city was in fact a state unto itself. And most of these city-states had their own gods, they had their own armies, they traded with each other, and sometimes they allied with each other. But in fact, each state was independent from other states. And this map is actually pretty interesting. Not only does it show you where those states are, but it gives you a pretty good cross-section of topography. So if you look at the topographic features that spread from about east in Athens across the what we call the Peloponnesus, that's that peninsula at the bottom here, across west, you can see what the terrain was like. Again, the mountains were pretty rugged, and again, that sort of topography segregated people from different city-states, so that may be one contributing factor why many of these city-states never united into one sort of country. Alright, now most of these city-states had fewer than 20,000 residents. So they weren't large cities like we might think of today with millions of people. But again, each city-state was sort of a country unto itself. So 20,000 residents would be sort of the amount of people that you might find living in Athens at, say, the height of its power. This is a picture that sort of depicts what ancient Athens and the Acropolis might have looked like at one point. Alright, so let's take a look at two city-states in particular. Again, we don't have time to do all these city-states. What we're going to do is compare the two extremes, Athens on one hand versus Sparta on the other. Let's start off with Athens. First of all, in terms of government, it would have a democracy, and it also had a council of 500. Sparta had two kings, a council of elders, and what they called were ephors, the 5 ephors. Now, their system of government was very different than the democratic system that was in Athens. Again, the 5 ephors tended to be the most powerful guys in Sparta who made most of the big decisions. The kings themselves were really just figureheads. Okay, in terms of Athens, we've got citizenship here, and basically it was male only, and slaves had no rights. So women basically couldn't be citizens in ancient Athenian society, only men could. And in Sparta, you had to be male as well, you had to be over 30, and they had these conquered people who were slaves. They were known as helots. So the original local people of the area of Sparta were known as helots who had been conquered by the Spartans and reduced to slavery. Okay, society in Athens. Boys were educated in reading, writing, music, poetry, and public speaking. Also, military training for fitness and athletic games was encouraged. In Sparta, their society began by having boys begin their military training at age 7. The emphasis on fitness, health, and serving the military was also very strong, so we often refer to the Spartans as being very militaristic. That may also have something to do with the fact that a large majority of their population were helots, who were actually slaves, and so the military emphasis in Sparta was based on basically keeping the slaves under control. Okay, in Athens, the role of women basically stated that women had to be subordinate to men, so they weren't equal to men. They could not own property, and they usually stayed in the home. In Sparta, women tended to be athletic like the men, but they were also subordinate to men as well. But they could own property, and that's a big difference because once you own property, that gives you sort of the economic freedom that allows you to have some decision-making power over your lives as a woman. Okay, in terms of trade and travel, it was fairly extensive in Athens. Athens was a sort of coastal city that had a large navy, and so had extensive trade across the Aegean and throughout the Mediterranean. And so they had a lot of people come and go as traders and travelers to Athens. Sparta, on the other hand, had limited or no trade or travel allowed. Basically, the Spartans were obsessed with sort of controlling the local population, and they wanted to keep things as simple as possible. So by sort of forbidding outsiders from coming in or limiting the number of traders who could come in, they also would limit the number of free ideas or new ideas that might flow into Sparta that might be sort of embraced by the local slave helot population. Now let's talk quickly about the Peloponnesian War, because as we know from looking at the notes that we just recorded, that Athens and Sparta were very different places, really opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of most of the Greek city-states. Again, Sparta is often associated with dictatorship, and Athens is often associated with democracy. But between 431 and 404 BC, the Athenians and the Spartans fought what was known as the Peloponnesian War. And as you can see on this map, you can see that both Athens and Sparta had victories, but they also had allies on both sides as well. But the general sort of twist with this war was that Athens was primarily a naval power and so relied on its navy to do most of its fighting. Sparta, on the other hand, had a very large military and a smaller navy. And so as a result, they relied mostly on sort of land conquest to fight their battles. And so it basically became difficult for the two sides to fight because in the case of Athens, they had an army, but not one that could compete with the Spartans. Now, over a period of many years, basically Sparta decided to eventually move towards Athens as a land battle, and as a result was able to conquer territory surrounding the city. At the time, the leader of the Athenians, Pericles, thought it was best to bring in the people from the surrounding countryside in behind the walls of ancient Athens for protection. This turned out to be not such a good move. They thought it would be good because they could continue to supply the city via ships that came into the port. But in the long term, what happened was a disease broke out, and a plague broke out through the city that killed a fairly significant portion of the population, and as a result, that weakened Athens. After many years of fighting between the two, an initial truce was signed, but years later, the Spartans basically found themselves under attack once again when the Athenian navy sent a huge navy fleet to the island of Sicily, and in an attempt to destroy the city of Syracuse, the city-state of Syracuse, which is actually a sort of colony of Sparta. This turned out to be a major military blunder. The navy and the 20,000 plus soldiers that were sent were basically wiped out by the Spartans, essentially destroying any military strength that the Athenians had left. And so that by 404 BC, Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War, and Spartan basically had come out the victor. Alright, so let's take a look at some other aspects of Athenian society that may have had some appeal. We know again that the Spartan system was based on dictatorship and control of a large population that was essentially enslaved. The Athenians, on the other hand, had the concept of democracy. So we often trace the origins of democracy back to ancient Greece, in particular Athens. So what does it mean to be a citizen in ancient Athens? First of all, you had to be male, you had to be 18 years old, and you had to be born of citizen parents. So you basically had to be a citizen that was born in Athens itself. In addition, they had laws that were voted on and proposed directly by an assembly of all citizens. So every citizen took part in the process of government. Again, keep in mind, not everybody was a citizen. You had to be male, 18, and born of citizen parents. That left out a significant portion of the female population, or maybe even the foreign population, and of course the slaves themselves. Okay, the leader would be chosen by lot. So basically how they decided who their leader would be was sort of a luck of the draw. And they had an executive branch that was composed of a council of 500 men. So that council of 500 men were the ones that made most of the major decisions. juries, which they had for court trials, varied in size, and there were no attorneys, there were no appeals in the court system, and most trials only lasted 1 day. Let's compare that to the system of democracy that we have here in the United States. To be a citizen of the United States, you basically have to be born in the United States or have completed a citizenship process. And what that means is that people not born here, what we might consider to be foreign, can come here, and if they take the citizenship test and live here a specific number of years, they can pass that test and become actually citizens of the United States. In fact, many Americans to this day are foreign born and actually come here and become citizens. Also, representatives were elected to propose and vote on laws. So we don't have a direct democracy where everybody gets to vote on every issue. Instead, we elect representatives to go down to Congress, for instance, and they propose and vote on the laws on our behalf. That's why it's called a representative democracy. We also elect a president. Okay, so it's not drawn by lot, but we actually choose which president we'll pick. The executive branch is made up of an elected and appointed officials. So in some cases, the president gets to choose who his officials will be, like the Secretary of State, for instance, or the Secretary of Commerce. But some officials are in fact elected officials. And the jury is composed of 12 jurors in our country. So what happens is if you have to go to court and you have to be in front of a jury of your peers, there'll be 12 jurors there to hear the case. And they should be people that come from your local community who have similar background and sort of status as you do. And then defendants and plaintiffs have attorneys. In fact, we also have a very long appeals process. So that's very different than what we saw in ancient Athens as well. So what do both Athenian and U.S. democracy have that's in common? First of all, citizens exercise political power in both systems. There's 3 branches of government in both systems. Both systems have a legislative branch that passes laws, and they each have an executive branch that carries out those laws. And there's also a judicial branch that conducts trials with paid jurors. So these are the similarities that you'll find between Athenian and U.S. democracy. So let's just take a quick look at this chart. It's very similar to the one that's in your journal and your textbook, and it allows you to see both the differences on either side and the similarities in the center. So you might want to study this Venn diagram, and it should help you to understand basically the differences and similarities between the direct democracy of ancient Athens and the indirect democracy of both the United States. So keep in mind, we trace our democratic heritage all the way back to ancient Athens, and although there are some similarities and there's some differences, it's essentially a democratic tradition.